My name is Alan Ahern. I'm the director of the Whittaker Institute here at NUI Galway. The Whittaker Institute is delighted to be associated with this conference. So this session is a policy roundtable. We have a great lineup of speakers. The format is going to be that the opening address, the organisers have penciled in 15 minutes for that opening address. And then for the panellists, we've penciled in 8 minutes each for each of the panellists. And that should leave some time, maybe 20 minutes or so at the end for questions and answers and dialogue amongst the room. You have the bios of all the speakers, so I'm not going to give a long introduction of everybody. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction. The panelists a little bit later. But our first speaker today, delivering the opening address, is Andrew Nugent, Head of Development at the Pensions Authority.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. What I'm going to try and do in the next 15 minutes is to just set the scene in terms of Ireland's pensions policy that hopefully will inform the speakers to come after me. So I'm going to jump straight into it just to talk about, in very broad terms, our pension system in Ireland. It's a multi-pillar approach. We have a first pillar, the state pension. Maximum payments under the state pension are for non-contributory pensioners of €232 a week. Maximum for contributory pension is €243 a week. That 243 equates to around 33% of average industrial earnings. Our second pillar consists of occupational pension schemes. So we broadly have three types here. We've DB, defined benefit funded. So that's private sector defined benefit. We've defined benefit in the public sector, which is unfunded. And we have defined contribution in the private sector. And a little bit later, I'll just give you a sense of the size and the scope of that sector. Then we have our third pillar, which consists of private individual pension plans funded from personal savings. So these may not be necessarily occupational related. These are personal pensions, a personal retirement savings account, or indeed additional voluntary contributions. So to talk again, just to set the scene in terms of the support for supplementary pensions, that second and third pillar. Ireland's taxation treatment of pensions involves what's known as an EET, exempt taxation system, whereby contributions to pension schemes are tax exempt for both employer contributions and employee contributions up to a certain limit. Pension fund growth is exempt from income or capital gains tax, and pension fund benefits are taxed at an individual's marginal tax rate when they're drawn down. There is an allowance for a tax-free lump sum in drawing down, and the rest of the income is taxed. So you might say that tax relief, I suppose, in broad terms, is income smoothing. The idea is it's supporting income smoothing for the individual, and then arguably there's a role whereby there is some income smoothing for the state. So it's tax foregone now, but tax gained later in that person's lifetime. So the pensions landscape in Ireland, defined benefit, I suppose like an awful lot of Western European economies, defined benefit was the main part of our pension system in the 70s and 80s. We had in 1990, we had around 2,500 defined benefit schemes. We're now down to 640 active defined benefit schemes subject to the funding standard, with about €65 billion of assets under management. 105,000 active members in the defined benefit in the private sector side. We have 98 unfunded pay-as-you-go schemes with 350,000. So that's public sector. That's teachers, guards, nurses, civil public servants, local authority, and there's around 350,000 people in those 98 unfunded schemes. In defined contribution, we've 70,700 active schemes with 329,000 members and in and around 43 billion euro of assets. Now, do need to point out we're much clearer on the defined benefit asset amount because clearly, given the funding promises that are being made, we in the authority would get much clearer detail and much more regular reporting detail on defined benefit. Personal retirement savings accounts, they were opened in around 2003, so there's just over 250,000 of those and 6.3 billion euro of assets. And then we've got personal pension plans, retirement annuity contracts, and there's around 200,000 or so of those. What I would say is that's the picture for active schemes. If we were to take active and frozen schemes, so a frozen scheme is a scheme where there are assets under management but there's no active contributions being made, that we've about 160,000 active and frozen schemes in Ireland. We've over 50% of pension schemes in Europe are found in Ireland. And depending on how Brexit works out, that percentage may most likely rise for 1% of the population. So you'll see a little later on where we in the authority and colleagues in government are looking to bring reform into pensions and reform the landscape. So I suppose what I would say, just to cover off that kind of opening, defined benefit is going to remain significant in terms of assets. So yes, we're seeing more defined benefit closures. There's a number of reasons for those, but it will certainly be a long tail. There's, as I said, about 105,000 active members in defined benefit. 425,000 people in this country have a deferred benefit in a DB scheme. There's about 102,000 pensioners. The liability, 50% of the liability relates to pensioners. About 22% of the DB liability of that 65 billion refers to active members, and about 23% refers to deferred members. So there's clearly a move to DC for future pension provision. There's going to be particular challenges, and I'll address those. And it's certainly, this is a long-run trend that we've seen. We expect that that's not likely to change, that DB is in something of runoff. There still are lots of employers who are very committed to their DB schemes. There are lots of trustees working very, very hard on behalf of their members to try and ensure those promises are met. Pension coverage rates. I might just say, give you a sense then of, and this is occupational pension coverage. So in terms of our workforce, in terms of our labour force, well, what's the kind of level of coverage? So what I'm using here are the Central Statistics Office, our official statistics office. They ran from 2005 to 2015 a number of pension modules in their quarterly national household surveys. And these are the levels of coverages. So you can see certainly from 2005 up towards 2008, the level of coverage went from around 52 to 53.5%. Clearly then, from 2008, it's been on a downward spiral. Certainly the global financial crisis hit pension coverage. Those who had the option of opting out, it would seem to us the data would show, certainly did opt out. So you can see the kind of trend. Now what I'd say about a couple of things about these sources of data, there's a couple of things. Firstly, it's a survey, it's not a census. So I think it is very useful in terms of trend, but I'm not sure it's necessarily accurate. So, I mean, I wouldn't be arguing with anybody that in 2005 we had 51.9. Certainly we might have had somewhere between 49 and 52 or 50. So there are issues around the fact that it's a survey rather than a census. The other thing that's interesting is that these coverage levels include the public sector, where by and large 100% of the public sector have pension coverage. So if you strip those out, what you were left with is much lower levels of savings in the private sector. So certainly the OECD, I think, mentioned a figure of around, I think, 37%, in and around that for the private sector. So this is despite fairly good levels of tax relief support. Levels of pension savings in Ireland are low and would seem to be quite stubbornly low. So I suppose it's just to give you a sense of where we are in terms of coverage rates. So I suppose as we think about the move to DC from our view in the Pensions Authority, the pensions regulator, there's a loss, I suppose, of that paternalistic role in that DB, the theory of DB, your benefit is set. Clearly, the funding has to reflect those promises made. That gets lost because the risk transfer is very much from the employer to the employee in a DC world. There's a lack of certainty about a final fund. If your fund is essentially, it's the contribution that's defined, your fund is then a product of the contributions being made and the investment gains or losses as they may be impacting, and then fees and charges being taken out. So there's a lack of certainty about your final fund. You've got choice and you've possible continued investment during retirement. Ireland, I suppose, like other European and Western economies, the attraction of annuities has fallen for various reasons. The cost of annuities has become much higher, and people are tending to take their money in retirement funds, so they're continuing active retirement, active investment, should I say, during retirement. So there's continuing management need. And this isn't going to just happen at 65. This is going to happen at 65, 75, 85, 95, that you have to make active decisions about what you want to do with your fund. There's actually some interesting, we're doing some work with the ERSI looking at TILDA data, and there's some very interesting work coming through on accumulation of assets during retirement in Ireland, that, you know, maybe the thought that we have everybody runs out of money. Well, actually, the data isn't supporting that, which is interesting, and it'll be good to see that as the TILDA data continues, the longitudinal data continues, to see if that finding remains. And then clearly in this DC world, the risk of cognitive decline is real. So you can make a decision at 65, but if you have to decide at 85, do I now want an annuity? Can you make that decision? Who makes that decision for you? So there's very, very particular challenges in DC. Given, I suppose, the size of the Irish pension system, we in the authority have, in 2016, we had a consultation on the future of DC. Essentially, our view is we have too many small schemes. You can see from the data, the average scheme in Ireland is tiny. When I talk to Dutch colleagues at various fora, when they talk about their medium-sized schemes of 5 billion, I have to be honest with you, as a regulator, I'm very jealous, because our medium-sized schemes are much, much smaller, and as a result, we think not as efficient. We've got concern about members' outcomes and complexity of decision-making facing members. So we are looking to reform, particularly the DC market, by increasing governance standards for trustees. We think there are some very, very fantastic trustees in Ireland, but we also think there are trustees that aren't as switched on as they should be. Their performance isn't what it should be, and they aren't giving the pension scheme the active management it needs. So we've a long-term view that we should have 100 to 150 DC schemes for this country. So that's moving from 160,000 to about 150. We don't think we'll get there tomorrow, but we still think this is something that needs to be done. We also would like to see a reduction in the number of pension vehicles. So pensions are confusing to people, but when you start talking about the options of defined benefit or defined contribution, a PRSA, an RAC, a buyout bond, a trust RAC, people's eyes glaze over. So clearly the number of choices of vehicles, which all are trying to do the same thing, are confusing to people and adding to the sense of under-provision for the future. A little word about maybe just in terms of what's coming. Fantastic. IORP2, I'm nearly there, Alan. I'll hit that target. IORP2 is coming along, second directive on the oversight of pension schemes. It's being transposed by January 2019, and it places increased governance requirements on trustees, including things like fitness and probity, key function holder requirements, higher level of proactive oversight by ourselves, the national competent authorities. So this runs alongside our reform proposals and will bring major change to Irish pension schemes. We think an awful lot of small occupational schemes will struggle to meet the requirements of IORP2, and we think that's not a bad thing because we think a lot of these small schemes need to amalgamate. You won't be able to probably read some of this, but I just want to make just reference. I know Robert from our department is here. He'll probably mention the pensions roadmap a little more detail. But certainly in February, the government published a roadmap which dealt with the first pillar, the second pillar, governance of schemes, and public sector schemes. So it's interesting that there's quite a move towards reform from ourselves, the regulator, from government, and it is being also directed through Europe. Final slide. Increasing longevity. Why is all of this important? Well, as I mentioned, some of the TILDA data, we're doing some interesting work with the ERSI. TILDA confirms income is positively associated with quality of life in older age, something that we'd all probably know in our gut, but is being shown through the data. So clearly, as life expectancy rises, people have to figure out, well, what is it I'm going to live on? What is it I'm going to survive on? And if the state pension isn't enough, then people are going to have to make other provision. Our concern in the regulator is that provision will be done in quality schemes that have better outcomes for members, that get people to have greater faith in the pension system. Our state pension age has risen in 2014 to 66. It's due to rise again to 67 in 2021 and 68 in 2022. So people are living longer, healthier, but there is a key question of how they're going to fund their retirement. So look, that's all I wanted to say just to set the scene, and hopefully you found that of use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Andrew, thank you very much. That was very informative. We have 5 panelists. We have a great panel, people from different organisations and therefore with different perspectives on the material that Andrew was talking about and other related materials. Just a very, as I said, their bios are in your information pack, so I'll just very briefly introduce them. Orla O'Connor is Director of the National Women's Council of Ireland. George Scully is Senior Information Officer at Age Action Ireland. And in order, Robert Nicholson is from the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. Liam Burney, Industrial Officer at ICTU. And right at the end there, Robert Anderson is Head of Social Policy Unit at Eurofound. As I mentioned, we've penciled in 8 minutes for each. Some of the panelists are going to use slides, some of them are not. So Orla, could I invite you to start, please?
Thank you. So I'm from the National Women's Council of Ireland, and the National Women's Council, we're Ireland's membership organisation of women, and we're a feminist organisation. So there's over 180 member organisations that are part of the Women's Council, and many of those organisations have older women involved who are very active and concerned in terms of the pensions issue, because it is such a gendered issue. It's a highly gendered issue. So I'm just going to use these few minutes to talk about some of the issues for women in relation to pensions, and particularly I think our concerns with the pension system in Ireland and the direction in which policy is going. So the current gender pension gap is at about 26% between women and men, and the government have named this as being a priority in terms of trying to close that gap. So in Ireland, in terms of the first tier and contributory state pensions, women predominantly rely on state contributory pensions for their income in older years, but they have no automatic entitlement to it. And the fact that only 41% of women receive the full contributory state pension, I think, indicates a real problem in Ireland, and particularly, there's two issues in relation to it. It's our legacy in Ireland because of the marriage bar. So the marriage bar was where women were forced to leave work when they got married, and it was only lifted in 1974, but is an enormous legacy issue for women who are receiving their pensions right now, because they had this big gap, and then when they returned to work, they often returned at a much lower level in terms of pay. So that's why we have such a low level in terms of women who are entitled to full straight contributory pensions. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And then we have the non-contributory pension, and that is the pension on which the majority of women are relying on. And what we have seen over recent years is that there were changes introduced which actually made it harder for women to build up the contributions that were necessary. The National Women's Council had a long campaign on that, and we've now seen some introductions within the state scheme to allow and to enable women to come into the system more. So we have now introduced a home caring credit, which is a welcome shift in terms of the recognition of unpaid care work, but it's only a partial solution because it doesn't address the accumulated disadvantage. And I think this is such a key issue in terms of our pensions, because you're seeing that cumulative effect of inequalities that women are experiencing throughout their working life. So only women who have been accessing their state pension since 2012 and future pensioners will now benefit from this, this home caring credit. So for us in the National Women's Council, we prioritise the issue of recognising the legacy issues that need to be addressed in terms of that marriage bar issue, in terms of the cultural climate in Ireland, which was very much about women leaving work. So even if they didn't work for the state sector, it was the norm of society at that time. So that's a really, I suppose, core critical issue. And it points to, and I think this is one of the important pieces, because in the current conversation about pensions in Ireland, we often talk about the gender issues as all being legacy issues, and that as more women are in the workforce, as more women stay in the workforce, that they will peter out and they will get solved. And that's simply not the case. Because what we know is that women are far more likely to be in low-paid, part-time jobs, precarious work, which make it really difficult right now, and will continue to do so, to collect sufficient PRSI contributions to be eligible for full state contributory pension. And also, we have the very prohibitive cost and also lack of access and availability of childcare and state support for care infrastructure in Ireland, which is another issue why it makes it so difficult for women to remain in full-time work. So we're increasingly contacted by women. And I mean, this is a real issue in the Women's Council, where we're contacted by women who come to their pension age and realise that they haven't built up the contributions that are necessary to get a full state pension, and then they find that they also may not meet the means testing criteria in terms of the non-contributory pension. So it's a very live issue in terms of women's issues in Ireland at the moment. And then to move to the private pension system, because in our view, and this is the issue in terms of current policy, the private pension system is not a sustainable answer for the vast majority of women to secure a decent income in their older years. So we have a problem with the state system, but we have policy that is very much about how to get more people to enrol into private pensions. And that isn't a sustainable answer, not just for legacy issues, but because of the situation right now in terms of women, in terms of low-paid work, and the fact that they still do the vast majority of caring work. I think in our last census, it was 98% of those who are caring full-time at home were women. So, as I said, it's highly gendered. And in addition, the piece I also wanted to just say in terms of the private pension system is that the private pension system, not alone is it gendered, but the makeup of the private pension system in Ireland shows very clearly that where tax reliefs are provided as an incentive to to people to take up pensions, they're very clearly weighted in favour of those on the highest earnings. So, I mean, it's estimated in 2014 that 72% of pension tax relief went to the top 20% of earners, and 5% of the population are getting 50% of the tax relief. So there's two critical issues in this, and both of them are very much weighted against women. And I just finally wanted to, because in the context of some of the wider issues that we're talking about here, in terms of the conference, is that we're also concerned, and I know some of these issues from talking to some people at lunch were brought up this morning, but we're also concerned about the recent increases in pension age. And I think, and it links to what I was saying in terms of the direction of pension policy generally, but there is a real lack of gender analysis going on in Ireland in terms of the direction of our pension policy. And that's absolutely needed. It's absolutely critical. So in relation to things like looking at the increase in pension age, we have to be talking about the health impact in terms of introducing longer working lives, especially for women, and particularly for women who are predominantly doing caring work in our society. And also, I mean, one of the things I think that is important in terms of looking at this issue of how you can integrate a strong gender analysis into our pensions policy. On a very positive side, the government have adopted what we call a gender budgeting approach and an equality budgeting approach in Ireland. It's a new development, and it's a very positive one. But it's one in which that we would think in the Women's Council that in terms of adopting that approach, it absolutely needs to be included and integrated when we're talking about the future of pension policy in Ireland. Because if it was, it could certainly move us far more in a positive direction. And for us in the Women's Council, and just to finish on it, where we want to see pension policy go, and where our members do, and women around the country, is that we move into a much more of a universal pension system that doesn't require contributions, it doesn't require that build-up entitlement, it doesn't discriminate against people who take time out to care or who cannot afford to pay into the system. So we need the pension policy, if it was to be a fully, I suppose, proactive in terms of equality model, to move in that universal pension direction. And also there needs to be a significant shift in investment away from private pensions, but into a universal pension that can give people a decent standard of living. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orla. George.
Not worth waiting for, I assure you. Okay. I'm Gareth Scully. I'm with Age Action Ireland. I'm just going to, I'm just going to skip the slides on Age Action. Okay. Okay. First of all, I'm going to start with the 2012 changes. What happened in 2012 was that the government introduced changes to how the contributory pension was assessed. Do you all understand the difference between a contributory and non-contributory pension? That the contributory is one you pay into and the non-contributory is one you don't pay into, but it's means tested. So the non-contributory is based on your income and it's on a sliding scale. So depending on how much you have, you may or may not be entitled to a non-contributory pension. Now, the contributory pension in 2012, they introduced a number of changes. They increased the number of bands, and they also, which meant that it was more difficult to get a full pension. This was done overnight almost and with very little warning, which meant that a lot of people didn't get the pension they were expecting. People thought they had a full record and then discovered that no, they were actually in a lower band and therefore didn't get the pension that they were expecting. And this affected women more than men because women tend to have a broken contribution record. They may not have been working for as long or as continuously as the men. So while it affected men as well, it affected more women than men. Now, in this year, 2018, the government introduced a total contributions approach, which basically, sorry, I tend to ignore my slides. The government introduced a total contributions approach, which meant that instead of averaging out your contributions over your lifetime to find out how many contributions you have, what they're going to do is they're going to just add all the contributions up, and there will be a percentage of, at the moment they're talking about 40 years being the full record, so it will be a percentage of 40 years, or the equivalent of a percentage of 40 years. What happens, sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Where was I? Oh, God. Yeah, in 2018, this new total contributions approach was introduced. The problem was the government just ignored the 2012 issue and introduced this system. The new system will ironically benefit women more than men because as you've heard, they've introduced this home care credits, 20 years, which will benefit women who had been out work over their career, but it won't benefit men who maybe were out of work for another reason, or maybe were self-employed and didn't pay contributions, or worked abroad and don't have contributions. So, ironically, the solution, the sticking plaster, actually benefits women more than it does men. Okay. The other issue that people, sorry, I'll just. Mandatory retirement is another major issue in Ireland at the moment. There's the public service, they're working towards allowing public servants to work until they're 70. Private sector workers, still, it's down to your contract. In Ireland, there is no mandatory retirement. There's no legislated retirement age in Ireland. But a lot of people in their work contracts, it states 65 or 66, because that was when the state pension was paid. So it made sense that the contract ended at 65 or 66. The state pension is now being paid, it's going to be paid at 67 and then at 68, which means that there are people being forced out of work at 65 and 66 as per their contract, and they are now having to wait maybe 1, 2, 3 years before they get the state pension. Those people are being asked to live on the what's known as job seekers benefit, which is basically an unemployment payment, so which is less than the state pension. I think at the moment it's about €50 less, so the government is actually saving an awful lot of money with those years. Age Action thinks that what is central is that Individuals have choice, that individuals can choose when to retire. And that may mean that the state pension is paid to some people at a lower age, but for those people who want to stay in employment, that they can continue to contribute to their pension, so they can build up a full record to get a full pension, or even if they already have a full record, to get an enhanced pension. Which would, the idea then is that because it's a pot, money will be paid into the pot by people who are continuing to work, and while other people are taking out of the pot at a younger age. The other thing about the government policy at the moment is that they are talking about They're talking about auto-enrolment into a private pension for workers, so that people who are on a low income and don't have a private pension, they will be auto-enrolled. They will be into a private pension. Now, I know Robert from the Department of Social Welfare is going to be talking about this, and he's the expert. But there are issues around it. And one of the issues concerning women is that if women, and personally I think it may change, I think the notion that women will always be the carers, I think that may change. I think people will start in the future making economic decisions and say, well, the woman is making more money than the man, and then it makes more sense for the man to stay at home and care. I think more people will be making those sort of decisions, and more men will become carers rather than the women. But I think women will, on the whole, continue to be, the majority of carers will continue to be women. And with auto-enrolment, women will be coming in and out of employment, and where Age Action is concerned, that the auto-enrolment may not make allowances for that people may leave employment and then re-enter employment and may lose the benefit while they're of the auto-enrolment. Right. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Gerard. And according to the programme, Robert Anderson from Eurofound is next, so Robert, will invite you to for your contribution.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I realise I am the brief diversion to the discussion about Ireland and pensions, because I'm coming from a European EU agency based here in Ireland, but doing work across all the member states. So I'm going to, I'm afraid, do some researchy things like introduce slides with data from the Labour Force Survey and the European Quality of Life Survey and the European Working Conditions Survey to try to support the arguments I want to make. I begin with a very familiar story to all of you in the audience about the changing employment rates of older workers in Europe since the year 2000. Here are the data from 2005 onwards. And what you see, of course, and most interestingly today, is the rapidly increasing employment rate of women aged 55 to 64. Now, the reasons for the increasing employment rates of older women and older men are somewhat different. Suffice it to say that at least part of the increase in women is attributable to the increasing numbers of younger women entering the labour market in the 1980s and the 1990s. For men, a significant part of the increase is associated with pension reforms, but that's not the whole story. The whole story is going to be told by Per Jensen in the next session, so I won't spoil it. The other thing I want to mention about these basic data on employment rates is how important the differences are between the EU member states. Very big differences between, shall we say, the northern and western member states and the eastern and southern member states. And what's particularly interesting about that is that those countries at the bottom of the employment rates chart, largely those countries of Central and Eastern Europe, have least experience of managing an aging workforce. And you will find least evidence of age management in companies in these countries. But over the next 10 or 15 years, these are the countries where the population of working age will shrink fastest, and where the proportion of the working population aged 55 to 64 will increase fastest. And I think we must pay more attention to and provide support to these countries of Central and Eastern Europe, some of whom we heard from earlier today. Of course, across all of Europe, addressing the questions about how do we manage an aging workforce and an aging population has reverted very often to the issue of pensions, using pensions as a vehicle to increase effective retirement age, either by giving fewer incentives for early pension or increasing pension age or cutting pensions and so forth. And I think Per will say more about that. But again here, we have the problem that a very significant proportion of people in Europe do not reach state pension age. And many of them leave the labour market for health reasons. So these kinds of measures are not addressing some of the population. What's needed, of course, are measures that both enable and motivate people to keep on working. This can be done using pensions, incentives and accruals with age, by providing increasing flexibility. And I'd like someone to speak about the opportunities for partial pension or combining work and pension, which is available in some member states, but not very many. Of course, on the other side, non-pension measures include all that kind of age management and addressing issues around health and learning and work design and work intensity and so forth. That can be done and are being done by some companies in some countries. But as I say, there's considerable interest. There's less interest in my slides than I thought. Oh, well, doesn't matter. I was going to show you a slide that said there's considerable interest in combining work with pension. And the first speaker was mentioning where do people over retirement age manage to get money, increase their pensions and so forth. And some of them are doing it through paid employment. And in fact, currently in Europe, about 14% of people over the age of 65 are in paid employment. 14% of those aged 65 to 69. Not that everyone wants to work after the age of 65. And here are some data from our recent European Working Conditions Survey asking people, at what age would you ideally want to stop working? And of those who specified an age, you see that 60, 61 are the preferred ages. So in all our discussions about extending working life, support, encouragement, and enabling are important because very many people don't imagine that they will work until the age of 65. And as you perhaps know, the effective retirement age in Europe for men is around 63 and a half, for women around 62 and a half. The age at which people actually stop working shows a lot of association with the sector of employment and the age at which people in that sector traditionally retire. And the age differences in retirement in member states or across member states show a lot of association with the current average age of exit, which is again an issue particularly for the Central and Eastern European member states. I wanted to show one slide on health for a couple of reasons. First of all, to show that this is a slide from a question asking people to assess the impact of their work on their health. Is it good for their health, bad for their health, or doesn't really affect my health? I want to introduce it for two reasons. One is to show the association with different occupations. We need to take occupation into account and different proportions of men and women in these different occupations, but also to show that some people think that that their work has a positive impact on their health. And so our discussions about the implications of extending working life shouldn't only be about negative effects. We should also be thinking about the positive. And you'll see, in fact, that quite a number of the oldest workers on these slides have rather more positive impressions of the impact of work on their health, and of course, partly that selection and filtering out of those with poorer health. Finally, I wanted to say something about unpaid work. I won't say much because we've spoken a lot already about the proportions of men and women providing unpaid care to children and to older adults or dependent persons. These are data from the 2016 Eurofound survey, just pointing to the profoundly high numbers, high proportions, particularly of older women workers who are providing care and support on a regular basis. Of course, this has implications for them in their working lives and in their caring lives, implications which are enhanced depending on the number of hours, amongst other things, that they are caring and the number of hours that they are working. Let me finish by pointing to data from 2007 to 2016, where we asked the same questions of carers in Europe, and the impression you should get from this slide is that the proportions of people reporting problems with work-life balance are higher in 2016 than they were in 2007. And maybe we can discuss some of these reasons. But measures in companies and in the state or government to improve reconciliation of work and family life are not showing positive results. The results of this kind of research and a lot of other policy-oriented research, of course, is being taken up at the moment at the EU level in reflections on the new European Pillar of Social Rights, which was agreed last November in Gothenburg, and which covers 20 guiding principles, amongst which are all of these highly related policy issues to the discussion we are having here. And the first of them that's being addressed with new legislation, we hope, is around work-life balance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. We have another Robert.
Hello, folks. Rob Nicholson is my name. And if I could just take one moment. I won't be relying on this, but just, I know some of you are from guys, technical. Where is it? Now, sorry, I need a hand technically. Rob Nicholson is my name. I'm responsible for pensions policy in the Department of Social Protection, Employment Affairs and Social Protection, and some of the issues that my colleagues have a concern with in relation to pensions policy in Ireland, I have some responsibility for. So I'll just lay that on the table. I'm going to reduce a couple of arguments down here very complicated arguments, but then we've 8 minutes, so I'm going to reduce them down to some fairly simple ideas. Based on our demographics and the fiscal cost of ageing, we have 4 choices. We save more, and we save more through taxation and redistribution of that taxation. We save more for ourselves, we work longer, or we get poorer. Very sophisticated arguments behind all of that, but to my mind, that's what it boils down to. So what do we want in our retirement? Most of us want to maintain our living standards. We don't want to hit retirement and have a reduction in our living standards at that stage or later on. That's the basic goal of all of us, yeah? So that's effectively where we drive pensions policy from. So in February of this year, our government launched a pension reform plan, which I was responsible for shepherding through the political process. It took a year and a half. There's 6 strands, 43 actions in that. Taking in this retirement income, addressing it primarily from a retirement income perspective, but also drawing in the longer working agenda. I'm going to concentrate on those 3 areas. Reform of the state pension, our first pillar, a new automatic enrolment system for people without personal pensions, supplementary pensions personal to themselves, and then supporting fuller working lives. So, our first pillar, state pension, is the bedrock of our pension system. It replaces about 34% of our earnings, average earnings. And that allows us to keep people aged over 66, about 1.5% of our over 66-year-olds are at risk of poverty under our own measures. About 8% of the general population are at risk of poverty. So our risk of poverty rates for our older people are quite low and perform well internationally based on a redistributive first pillar pension. But that pension faces sustainability challenges based on our demographics. So broadly speaking, every 5 years in Ireland, the state cost of our state pension goes up by €1 billion. At the moment, it's about €7 billion a year. So every 5 years now, consistently into this future 40 or 50 years, our state pensions are going to increase by about €1 billion. And that's because of longevity. People are living longer, drawing pensions for a longer period of time. We have about 600,000 people aged over 65 now. In 40 years, we'll have 1.2 million. So a doubling of our elder population and a lengthening of lives and a lengthening of the period in which we have to fund that. So in order to maintain our state pension at 34% and keep older people out of poverty, we obviously need to fund that. And our social insurance fund, which funds that, goes into deficit relatively soon and fairly significant deficit thereafter. So how do we maintain those payments to our older people to keep them in poverty? And how do we ensure from an intergenerational equality point of view that the younger population who are contributing to this pay-as-you-go system to pay our older people have the same opportunity when they hit retirement to spend the same broad period of time in retirement? Is it fair to ask a population now to fund a retirement system when they may not be entitled to somewhat of the same type of benefits when they hit retirement? That's what drives our state pension. So some of the reforms we have brought in, our government has confirmed for the first time it intends to formally link through an indexing system our state pension to 34% of average earnings to maintain people out of poverty. We are introducing a new total contributions approach, which is being referred to. So the OECD analysed the Irish pension system and said there's a very weak link between contributions made and benefits drawn from the system. So we are introducing a system which will require a certain amount of years' contributions to then draw a pro rata benefit based on that contribution. From the gender perspective, which was mentioned earlier on, that is an intent for both carers and homemakers and others who spend periods of time out of employment to have a fairly significant number of credits for periods out of the workforce. At the moment, we have in and around 20, depending on the particular circumstance, but on an EU level, very generous, we would say, periods for credits outside the workplace for a social insurance-based system. Our state pension age increases to 67 in 2021 and 68 in 2028. It's already at 66, so fairly advanced by international standards. After 2035, we said we're going to link it formally to review of life expectancy. And that's broadly to say, as I mentioned earlier, to keep an eye on the broad proportion of your working life you spend in work and in retirement, and to make sure that over the long term we can all have a broadly similar proportion working and a similar proportion of our lives drawing from a retirement system. And then our system is going into deficit, so we have to look at a sustainable funding system over the longer time to allow us to make sure we can pay the benefits that we're promising out of the system. So that's our first pillar. And we would say our first pillar performs relatively well by international standards. It achieves its goal of poverty avoidance. But then we have supplementary systems. What's the goal of a supplementary system? To allow us generate a level of income for ourselves that allows us to continue our living standards. And that involves an element of being earnings related. So our government, for the first time, has said we're going to introduce an automatic enrolment system by 2022. We're the only country in the OECD, out of 37 OECD countries, without an earnings related element to a retirement savings system. New Zealand is somewhat close, but more sophisticated than ourselves. So the OECD said to us, the single greatest goal of your retirement system should be to introduce a mandatory or quasi-mandatory earnings-related system. So we're going to do that by 2022. And that's intended to supplement a very determined first pillar state pension and complement the existing private provision that's there. So as Andrew mentioned, only 35% of the Irish working population in the private sector have private provision. Many, many of those will face a serious reduction in their living standards in retirement if they don't begin to save. And they don't save because of inertia, generally speaking. So that system will be introduced. I won't talk about it too much, but it is an earnings-related system. For the first time, employers will be compelled to make contributions on employees' benefits, and the system will facilitate but not demand choice. So you'll be automatically enrolled based on behavioural economics. We know if we get it right, most won't opt out, but it will be free choice. There will be a choice to opt out if you so choose. So there's elements of the system that are up for consultation there. I won't go into them, to be frank, but it's a major piece of work that's ongoing at the moment. Just in terms of the fuller working lives aspect, as I say, we can save, we can put more money aside, but we know there's a need for fuller working lives, as we call it. At the moment, we have some reforms going through the system at the moment in Ireland. We're changing legislation that allows public servants stay as public servants in the workforce up to the age of 70. Previously, they had to work to 65, and that was seen as the public service providing a lead in longer working. We're developing proposals that allow individuals to defer their state pension and continue to make social insurance contributions if they haven't built up a full record, and also to defer drawdown of their state pension to have an actuarially adjusted pension then when they do eventually draw it down. Those proposals are being developed at the moment. No government decisions by any means on them. They're very complicated areas, but being looked at. Many of you will know that there's an EU regulation around objectively justifying retirement ages. I think it's fair to say that both industry, employers and unions felt that there was a lack of transparency in terms of how that would operate, to allow employers and employee representatives have the discussion about how do we allow people to work into their longer years based on previously agreed contracts about retirement at the age of 65, which might be called the cultural norm for retirement in Ireland. So there's been a number of initiatives there in terms of our Workplace Relations Commission, an industrial relations kind of framework, and then also some guidelines in the wider system to allow employers and employees engage and work through that contractual situation. We're also involved in a communications campaign, which will probably be launched next year, in relation to improving awareness around the benefits to older workers of longer working. And this comes into the space of not just the idea of the fiscal benefit to the individual in the state or the finance benefit to the individual in the state, but also around physical health and well-being, cognitive health, socialisation and so on. And we have data which highlights that in amongst a certain cohort, that withdrawing from the world of work at an earlier stage than you might has physical and mental health challenges for certain groups. Now, on the converse of that, when we're introducing these systems to try and promote longer working, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that many people may not be physically or mentally capable of it and have safety nets in place for them. So there's a discussion ongoing in the kind of public policy environment in Ireland at the moment about how you do that. So that's a kind of rapid run through of the various measures we're putting in place, all of which are subject to extensive debate, as you can imagine. But essentially, what underpins pensions policy reform in Ireland is what I mentioned earlier on. Due to our demographics and the need to make our system sustainable, we need to look at those four ideas of taxing more, saving more personally, working longer, or else understanding that when we hit retirement, we won't have the funds there that we would like for ourselves to continue into retirement. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Liam.
Thank you, Chair, and Liam Burney is my name. I'm here today representing the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. I don't have slides. It's not that I didn't think about what I was going to say here today, but I found sometimes when I put up slides about what I might predict in the future, I get it terribly wrong, so they get me into trouble. So I've decided for this particular discussion, slides are a dangerous thing to have. But look, just to say this is a very live issue. The issue of longer working lives is a very live issue within the trade union movement. I started work in 2000 as a working trade union official, and in that year I negotiated 6 agreements with different employers about reducing retirement age from 65 towards 60. And 18 years later, which is it's a tiny piece of time really when you think about it, the debate has turned completely on its head now, and it's about whether we can facilitate people working longer and what circumstances we do that. And I think I just want to say about 5 or 6 things within the 8 minutes that I have, if that's okay, Chair. First of all, I think the reason why we're having the discussion about longer working lives have been influenced by a number of factors. Firstly, there's influence by the change in pensions policy. In particular, the increase in the eligibility age for the state pension in the Republic of Ireland is an enormous issue that's influencing people's demand or maybe expectation to work longer. Also, there is, as other speakers have pointed out, there is a lot of people have inadequate income in retirement, and a lot of people only have the state pension, and there's a question about whether they will be able to maintain their standards of living with simply the state pension. But for a growing number of people as well, though, they have, and this is drawn from research and anecdotal evidence among our membership. I have no empirical data to show this, but for a growing number of people who have taken on financial commitments later in their working lives, there's an imperative to work longer. So they might have helped their kids with a deposit for a house, or they might have. Apparently, a lot of kids now, I'm dreading this myself, but a lot of kids go into stay in education up to 25 and 26. And they're funding that as well, and therefore have that financial responsibility. And hey presto, when they come to retirement age, or what they expect to retire, they have a debt arising from their children's education. That's kind of scary, but that's the reality of it for some people. So I just wanted to say 4 or 5 things, as I said, in respect of them, things that have happened and where Congress sees and where the trade union movement sees the direction of how the direction of policy should go in the future. We are very, very concerned about the changes in the retirement age, or the access to the state pension from 65 to 66, which it is now, to 67 and up to 68. It's our view that policy change was made simply by reference to mathematics and had no actual view to the social policy of that, the social implications of that, and whether in fact people were capable of working beyond a legitimate retirement expectation age of 65. There are lots of occupational groups that will simply not be able to work beyond 65 years of age. And quite frankly now, without being disparaging to anybody, and certainly not to Robert, I don't think any real consideration was given to that. It was a mathematical actuarial exercise, and we're strongly of the view that a look needs to be taken at that again, because we're moving faster, much faster towards 68 than any of our peer countries in the European Union. So the other thing that I think is important, and the last speaker touched on it, or sorry, the speaker before Robert touched on it, the first Robert, talked about actually, does everybody want to work longer than 65 or 66? And the reality is they don't. That they actually are forced into a situation where, for the reasons I've spoken about, perhaps they have a requirement to work longer. So I think it's critically important that whatever we do and whatever policy initiatives we put in place, that they're, if you like, based on a voluntary approach to agreeing to work beyond what was your legitimate retirement age. So you get to 65 and you want to retire, well then there's no impediment for you to do so. providing, of course, financially you can. That there's no compulsion to work beyond what your contractual working age was. Because I think if you've worked for 30 or 40 years with an expectation that you can retire at a particular time, I think it's absolutely critical that you're allowed to do that. One eye kind of to the future and what the second Robert was talking about, there are long-term plans to address adequacy of retirement income. But there is a requirement to address the short-term measures that give rise that arise and the current shortfalls that exist that won't be addressed by the long-term plans that Robert has talked about. And I think one of the things we need to talk about, as I've said earlier, is how we bridge that gap between people retiring at their contractual age and what might happen to them until they actually get the state pension if the ages are to continue as people have talked about. A third issue I think that's important is the whole question of intergenerational solidarity. And not just from the perspective of younger people paying for people in retirement, but also kind of access for younger people to work. Because at the moment, of course, we have lots of work, apparently, where the economists will tell you we're very close to full employment. That's not the case in every part of the country. It might be the case in Dublin. But we won't always be like that. And there is a question about kind of whether it's legitimate for people to continue to stay in the labour market after a particular age when there's a large group of young people unemployed. And I think that's not something that's very much said in the debate, but there is this aspect, there is intergenerational solidarity has to work both ways. And it has to work for young people and it has to work for older people as well. And then just finally, 3 final points in respect of the government's plans to increase pension coverage. I think one of the critical things, and Orla in our first speaker referred to this, is the question of the low rate of, or the lower rate of female participation in the labour force. And I think critical to ensuring that the gender issue around income and retirement is tackled is that we remove all the barriers to female participation in the workforce. That we have adequate childcare, that we have affordable childcare, and all the barriers that exist to full participation of both genders in the labour force are removed, and that's not the case currently. I don't disagree with Orla around the question of having a universal pension system, but I think critical to female participation in the labour force is actually removing the barriers that currently exist. The second thing I want to say is about the reliance, or kind of the problems that exist for private sector pension provision. And one of the critical ones is the trust in the financial system, the private financial system, to provide pensions for people who have put years and years of savings into them. And quite frankly, with the recent experience in this country, trust in the financial system is very, very low. And the auto-enrolment scheme that Robert is talking about the government introducing will be a massive fund. And given the performance of the financial system in the recent past, I think people will be very, very nervous about putting a fund like that into the hands of the private sector for perhaps kind of what might be, in some cases, potentially foolhardy speculation and also kind of very, very high cost of administration and all the rest of it. And finally, I do think kind of that the state does need to take a much more active role in providing pensions for people outside the state pension. People spoke earlier about, the first speaker spoke about annuities and what you do with your pension pot and DC schemes when you come to retire. You've got 2 or 3 options. One of them is to buy an annuity. The cost of them are just absolutely ridiculous. Kind of, you get €1 for every 26 or 27 euro you're prepared to invest. So in the consultation process that Robert spoke about, from the department Robert spoke about, he talked about how the state can play a better role. One of the things the state could do is to provide annuities. In other words, kind of that you could invest your pension pot, you give your pension pot to the state, and what the state does with that kind of money you've given them is to increase the rate of your state pension. So instead of getting the standard state pension, you get an additional amount of state pension that relates to the amount of money you put in from your private savings. And I think that would move us more and more kind of towards the European model kind of providing universal pensions. So I just wanted to offer them four or five thoughts in the context of the discussion today, and to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Liam. Those were all really great contributions, and my thanks for them. We have about 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. And they're really, it's a great presentation, so I'm sure there are plenty of questions. I know Orla in particular is under time pressure and needs to be gone by 2:45. We have a mic up here for the panelists, and there'll be a floating mic for anybody, for anybody who wants to ask a question. So are there any questions to the panelists?
Hi, my question is to Orla O'Connor. Thank you very much for a fascinating paper. I think your bottom line was to do with the integration, the need to integrate women after retirement age into the labor market so that they can increase their income. I think I'm not wrong on that. But what kind of opportunities await them in the labor market? What kind of quality of opportunities? Are they going to be treated properly as employees?
Yeah, please.
Well, I think the main thing is it's not so much about getting back in later. I think it's what's happening to women's working lives before pension age. So I think that bit is critical. So absolutely, in terms of like the piece I was saying about being, low-paid precarious work, their ability to pay into a pension is significantly reduced in comparison to men. So the only real way, if we're going to reduce the gender pensions gap, is a real shift. It's a shift away from our private pension model into one that invests in a much stronger way in our state pension. And if there is to be a second tier, which that's probably the reality, is that it needs to be done within a state second tier, as in through our PRSI system, which can also allow for periods of care. So there needs to be a shift away from the investment that we're putting into private pensions through our tax relief system into that state system. That's ultimately what we see as a way of reducing the pension gap. Now, as well as all the other pieces around the fact, in terms of low-paid work and also how you provide proper infrastructure for care, and the cultural shift between care, the balance of care responsibilities between women and men. So there are lots of issues surrounding pensions, as well as particular ones that we need to do within pensions to reduce the gap.
Question over here, this lady on my right.
A question to all the panel about the relationship between state pensions and private pensions, particularly relating to the automatic enrolment in Ireland. If women have got interrupted career trajectories and they're out of the labour force for significantly more time than men, how are you going to get a shift into that compensation if initially women are disadvantaged by their life course, caregiving? I just want to make one other comment. I'm from Australia, and the Leader of the Opposition now has made a proposal that superannuation contributions through the private sector continue through periods of maternity leave and caregiving. In other words, the state compensates for periods out of the workforce, and that seems to be getting some degree of support.
Anyone from the panel like to either the question or even comment on that particular proposal from Australia?
I might take it as a start anyway, because I have responsibility as project manager for the automatic enrolment process we're going through in Ireland. So we released what's called a straw man here a couple of months ago, which was a line of sight really on how we saw the model operating. I think, as we mentioned earlier, the gender gap in terms of income around a state pension is about 1% between males and females. Now, the source of where that income comes from is quite different in terms of contributory or non-contributory, but at that level, it's actually quite equal. the gender gap and the second pillar are personal pensions around employment-related pensions is about 26% in terms of income. Coverage is actually somewhere around the same. So about 47% of the population, males and females, have personal occupational pensions. But the income that comes out the far end is about 26% less for women. And to an extent, that's a feature of our history and a very quickly changing labour market, and that female labour market participation rates are increasing and increasing all the time. But they will always, in an employment-related system, they will always suffer from the kind of triple whammy of the female life, I suppose, as it stands in Ireland, and that is, generally speaking, less pay per hour, generally speaking, less hours, and more time spent out of the workforce for child rearing and so on. Now, the question is whether an earnings-related system, a pension system, is the tool to fix that, or whether we're really looking at changes around the labour market and societal norms in that space and childcare and so on that allow greater levels and more equal treatment of men and women in the labour market. But an earnings-related system as it stands won't address that pure issue. And we would say that it needs sort of broader societal change. However, we have asked in our consultation specifically around the gender issue and around carers and others, should there be some sort of extra supplement, or are there any ideas as to how we would temper the impact on the gender change? I would say for automatic enrolment, the type of cohort we're talking about enrolling is generally lower earners, generally more precarious employment, and generally multi-jobbers. And to a greater extent, that includes, particularly at the lower ends, more women proportionate to men, also ethnic minorities, and also people with disabilities. So it hits a particular group and will improve the situation for many, many women that don't have pensions at the moment, but it will not address the 26% gender income gap in and of itself.
Any of the other panellists like to comment on the automatic enrolment? Do we have any other questions?
Sorry.
Thank you for such an interesting panel. I have 3 points I'd like to make. The first is the perverse redistribution of income that occurs when private pensions get tax reliefs. People who cannot afford to pay in or have low pay subsidize the pensions of more affluent people. That is wrong. Secondly, the idea that generations are pitted against one another in the world we live in, it doesn't necessarily need to be so. We're not pieces in a balance sheet. We're human beings with families and younger and older people we care about. I worry about my mom. I worry about my grandchildren. And when we dehumanize a whole segment of the population, the elderly, we miss the point that a single birthday often determines whether someone is elderly or not, and we forget that we all age through the life course. And I think that's poorly considered in many of the policies that are being put forward. And my final comment, and I'd be happy to hear from anyone on the panel, is the capacity for mischief in the private sector financial management of our futures. I, for one, don't trust big banks and financial managers to be looking out for me. They're looking out for their bottom line. And they're not looking out to save the state of Ireland from paying state pensions either. So any comments?
Three excellent comments. Would anybody on the panel?
On the issue of intergenerational solidarity, there's no evidence that getting rid of the cohort of older people means that you will automatically employ younger people, or that the people will just move up. What will happen is, if they do employ younger people, they will be employing younger people at much lower salaries. So intergenerational solidarity is not something that we should be this sort of competition between the generations is not something we should be encouraging.
Andrew.
Three excellent comments, quite a bit to chew through, but just maybe to take the first and the third, others may want to. I think, yes, if you take pensions tax relief on its own, I think any tax relief taken on its own, you can look at it and say, well, if you take it in isolation, there's a perverse kind of effect. I think you've got to take I think you've got to ask the question whether that's an intended or unintended consequence. So I think tax relief maybe needs to be seen in terms of tax deferral. And once the tax system taxes people who benefited from higher tax relief, it can be a source of income smoothing for the state. So certainly it's an area that becomes quite emotive, certainly in Ireland, and I know from studying in other countries. But I think you've got to look over the life cycle of certainly an individual in the state. On your point about not trusting banks, whatever about your view in the States, I think the view of banks in Ireland is summarised, they're bankers, and people just, we don't tend to like them after what has happened. But certainly on the pension side, part of our drive to have a smaller number of schemes is to have closer supervision of people's savings, so that as a regulator, we have prospective, forward-looking, if you like, principle-based regulation that is quite in trustees' faces on behalf of people, watching the financial management of those schemes. So certainly we would have concerns, and part of our concerns is our system, our pension system is too scattered.
Robert Anson or Liam, would you have any comments?
I've no intention of getting into a debate with my colleagues on the panel, but just to say in respect of the financial system, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think one of the things that's critically important, if we're moving to an auto-enrolment scheme, with the amount of assets that's going to be in it, is that people will only have trust in such a scheme if they know that at the end of the scheme they have some actual kind of chance of realising the benefits, plus the contributions, plus what might have been earned on it, and return in a decent way. If it's completely relying on the private sector, I think we're going to have a crisis in trust, given what's happened in this country in the last 10 years. So I think the question is a very valid one, and one that's well made.
Perhaps a comment on the intergenerational relations, because as part of our European Quality of Life Survey, we ask in all 28 member states about tensions in society and people's perceptions of tensions in society. And in fact, tensions between old and young nearly always ranks very close to the bottom of the list, so that in everyday life, people don't see very many tensions between old and young compared to tensions between rich and poor, or management and workers. Some of you may know that in the UK, the Resolution Foundation has recently produced a very extensive report on intergenerational equity. And when you get into the detail, in the UK at least, you can see very many reasons why there should be more intergenerational conflict because of the, shall we say, more advantaged treatment of older than younger people for lots of historical reasons. In answer to the question, the point that Liam made earlier on about older people taking the jobs of younger people and making these jobs available, the usual response has been to say, it's the lump of labour fallacy, and that's not the case. However, last year, OECD produced a report saying that under certain circumstances and in certain places, at local or community level, you can see ways in which there may be an issue about older people being in jobs, working for longer, younger people having difficulty to access those jobs. And I think it's something that's worth revisiting.
Thank you. Robert Della, will you leave the final word to you?
Maybe just a quick one on tax relief. I've been working in pensions for 6 or 7 years now, and I have a fixed idea on most things. Whether that idea is right or wrong is another question, but I have a fixed idea. The one I don't have a fixed idea on is tax relief. And it depends what you include in your conversation. Do you include a redistributive first pillar? Do you include personal pensions on their own? Do you include employer contributions? And just to give you a measure of what's being said to me in the middle of that argument as an automatic enrolment person, some of the right, I suppose, if we could put it crudely that way, would say, well, it's not surprising that the top 20% get 72% of tax relief because they pay 80-something% of tax. And it's not surprising that there's over 50% not benefiting from tax relief because they don't pay any tax. And also higher earners pay a significant amount more social insurance, which is then redistributed to others. Now, I say that just as a kind of counter. I'm not sure whether I agree with it. I'm not sure what my position is on tax relief. Trying to get transparency in including not just the individual's contribution, but everything that falls into tax is really, really difficult. And the only thing I'm sure of is I hesitate to listen to anybody who says they have the right answer to that. Just a kind of word of caution in terms of the state versus the private sector. There is ways of, as we say in Ireland, one keeping manners on the other. What the state has a deficit at the moment of about €320 billion, which in the context of Irish GDP is very significant in terms of provision of future benefits in the coming years at state pension, first pillar level. The state, in case of future economic shock and so on, will obviously suffer because of that. And the payments to our society and to our individuals will suffer because of that. Taking extra fiscal risk on in terms of taking the responsibility for a second pillar system or a personal pension system has major challenges about it. Part of the kind of de rigueur element of pensions provision and pensions economics is that we spread risk amongst the state, amongst ourselves as individuals for ourselves at the higher end, and amongst the employer population. And any sort of idea that the state can take on this massive fiscal risk onto its balance sheet and guarantee pensions over a long period of time is something that we really need to watch out for, because what happens when it hits the buffers or when there's issues is that that first pillar, that basic level of protection that the state can give to people, comes into question. So I'm not taking a position one way or the other, but there isn't any sort of magic wand towards making money work for people as individuals, but also for the economy more generally, so that we can generate income in years to come. Not an easy thing to answer.
Thank you, Robert. We've gone a few minutes into the coffee break. Anya, thanks a million, Orly.
You mentioned, Robert, about ideas around safety nets for people, with health issues or in physically demanding work. Do you know what kind of policies are being considered in relation to that? Because that's something that's come up in my research.
I suppose we're obviously increasing state pension age to 60, as it stands under Irish legislation, 67 in 2021 and 68 in 2028. So there are a number of groups put together at a kind of public policy level. I suppose the argument would have been in years past, as the point was made by Liam here. Apologies, Liam. I do know his name, but it's gone blank there. That the increase to state pension age was done without thinking about the other supports that are needed to allow people work later. Health, tax, childcare, all the other things that are required. So there's an interdepartmental group, and a couple of them have looked at this issue to identify the kind of supports that are needed for people to work into longer age. And I would imagine, I'm not on it myself to be frank, I would imagine that those things will start to see themselves through over the next couple of years. And that's around cooperation across government departments in terms of health provision, taxation, drawdown rules for pensions and so on, whilst maintaining those kind of safety nets. As I say, it's a particularly difficult one to try and address, because what sort of protections do you put in place that doesn't effectively deconstruct a particular retirement age? So if I talk about Liam again, I would have had Liam's former colleague talking to myself saying it's all right having a state pension age of 67 or 68. My colleagues joined the workforce at 14. They contributed to a social insurance system for 40 years. They won't be able to draw it down for too long because their life expectancy is lower. But how do you institutionalise those type of things to be able to allow people make decisions for themselves without decoupling it? So you're talking about either deferral of state pensions or early access to pensions, but trying to put that into place is really difficult.
Yeah. Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So why? I'm just wondering, why have they not removed the mandatory retirement age? I noticed for public servants it's gone up to 70 now, but in the UK, for example, they don't have a mandatory retirement age.
I don't think that's. Now, this will require a legal decision, to be honest, at ECG level. But our law and the Equality Act stems from the European Directive, which most of you are familiar with, and that requires that we objectively justify retirement ages, and we do so based on a legitimate aim. There is a societal norm in Ireland of state pension age being traditionally at 65, of being the age at which an employer and an employee agree a retirement age. That is not sacrosanct in any way. It's an employer-employee agreement. There is no mandatory retirement age in Ireland. And over the last number of years, there's been a few cases brought through our industrial relations body, the WRC, based on unfair dismissals of people at 65, that it wasn't objectively justified. And that, I think, is working its way into the system, perhaps not as quickly as some would like. And I know certainly our ICTU colleagues and IBEC, the employer body, have said it's a really difficult decision for employers and employee representatives to allow employers understand what sort of ground they're on about making that objectively justifiable decision. How do you do it? And I think employers and trade unions feel that they haven't got a pitch on which to play, a set pitch. So there is some work being done around WRC guidelines, around guidelines between IBEC and ICTU, employers and trade unions, about how that level of engagement is done. But I do think there is a consideration around the idea of giving a better steer to employers and trade unions about what objective justification is, to allow an employer and employees judge about if year 65, who is it legitimate to allow to extend and who not. But a tough space again, but I would say there's no mandatory retirement age in Ireland. And in fact, England, the UK, brought themselves to our level rather than the other way around.
Liam, it looks like you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just very one quick point on the question of moving beyond kind of 65. The vast majority of queries that trade unions get about this question is not actually about kind of wanting to work longer, but is actually kind of, I want to retire now, and I'm feeling pressure kind of to work longer. So I don't think myself, and maybe kind of maybe the academics will prove me wrong on this, but kind of anecdotally, kind of what the impression I get is that for union members anyway, when they get close to the state pension age, their feeling is, what do I have to do in order to make sure kind of that I can retire now as opposed to working longer? There are a small exceptional group, and it's an exceptional group of people in their experience who actually want to work longer. And there are people, the people who want to work longer are in particular occupations and in particular types of work. But it's not the vast majority of workers, in our experience, don't actually want to work beyond their contractual working age, just to make that point.
Yep. Thank you very much for all those questions, and on your behalf, I'd really like to thank all the panellists. It was very informative roundtable. Thank you very much.